Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight, consumer price index numbers came out yesterday, and inflation is at a 40-year high. And the White House today told all Americans inside Ukraine that they should leave immediately. We've got that and more tonight on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm Andre Laborde for this Friday, February the 11th, 2022. I hope your week went well. Well, coming up tonight, we've got a show you do not want to miss. Vladimir Putin, tonight, the head of Russia, has over 130,000 soldiers on the borders of Ukraine. He says he has no intention of invading Ukraine, that he's assembled all these battalions of armed soldiers and now moved even his medical units in place for a non-invasion. Well, the White House today has told all Americans inside Ukraine that they should leave immediately, that an invasion by Russia to Ukraine could happen at any time. Now, tonight, we're going to be talking with Major General James Livingston. As a Marine captain on the battlefields of Vietnam, he was awarded our country's highest award for valor and heroism, the Medal of Honor. Many who receive that medal receive it posthumously and not ever able to raise a family or just grow old. Fortunately, Captain Livingston did live and had a 33-plus year career in the U.S. Marine Corps. He served in many locations and led many Marines in everything from a rifle company to thousands, and his last command was of all Marine Reserves, as we know it as WYES, which is the Marine Forces Reserves in New Orleans, Louisiana. Major General James Livingston will be with us tonight. But first, yesterday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released January's Consumer Price Index numbers, and the numbers were not good. For the last 12 months, from January of 2020 to last month, inflation rose at 7.5%. Not since 1982, for 40 years, has the United States seen a jump in inflation to this extent. Now, if you remember, originally the administration said that inflation may be temporary or transitory, but it's only due to the pandemic and will go away, but more money will be needed to be pumped into the economy with the Build Back Better bill. That needed to be passed. Well, that bill died in the Senate, so more money was not pumped into the economy from the bill. But the Federal Reserve is still buying $115 to $120 billion in bonds. That is flooding the economy with more money. So when you go into the grocery or try to fill up your tank for gas, you feel that price creep, a slow, steady increase in prices that you have to pay, and you're thinking, is it your imagination or is it actually happening? No, it is true. It is happening. Housing on average is up almost 4.5%. The cost of financing a 30-year mortgage has gone up 7.7%, and that's just in 1 week to 4%. And that was just, it went up from last week of 3.75%. Food is up 12%, appliances are up almost 10%, and gas, well, we've noticed when you try to fill up your tanks, you know that feeling. But how did the markets do this week? Well, the Russia-Ukraine tensions this afternoon sent stocks lower, and all indexes went into the red for the week. The Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ all posted weekly losses. This week, the Dow Jones ended at 34,737. It was down 1% for the week. And the S&P 500 ended at 4,418. It was down 1.8% for the week. And finally, the NASDAQ. They ended the week at 13,791, and it was down 2.1% for the week. The price of oil is surging to over $94 a barrel today. When the Biden administration approved last year of the European Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this boosted Russia's leverage over Europe. Now, Russia could weaponize the oil and gas that they supply to Europe so as they not become involved with the United States. Well, Let's get to our guest tonight. Major General James Livingston. He spent over 33 years in the Marine Corps. He started off as a second lieutenant and ended up as a major general. As a Marine captain while in Vietnam, he was awarded the nation's highest award for heroism and bravery, the Medal of Honor. His last command was head of all Marine Force Reserves in New Orleans, Louisiana. But best of all, he's here with us tonight. Hi, General. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be talking with someone from New Orleans.
Well, New Orleans sure misses you, General.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it was a great time in New Orleans with all you great folks.
You know, there's so much going on in the world today. And in regards with what's going on right now with Ukraine, what should America's position be with regards with Putin on the borders right now of Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we reduced our position of strength. And, we look at our armed forces and what we've done with them and what we're attempting to do with them when cutting the budget. And the only thing they respect is strength. I think the thing is that we can collect our allies and all talk from a common sheet of music. In the short term, that is the best possible solution we can come up with. The next thing we need to do is cut off their source of capital. And this administration allowed that to happen through the pipeline. If they can deal with Germany and cut off that source of capital to Russia, I think those are two opportune moves we can take right at this particular point and show that we're in a position of strength. I think particularly with the pipeline, I see that as one of the most strategic moves we can make.
Did it surprise you, General, that right after President Biden took office, they closed the Keystone pipeline and he reinstarted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in Europe?
I absolutely can't figure that out. I've run through these options through my mind, and I frankly don't understand, particularly the one in Europe. I think the one in the U.S. he was appealing to the people in his party that had elected him, the people that go on the green side, if you will, and our global warming side. But the one between Germany and Russia, I have never been able to understand that. And it was so clear to me that he was opening up a funding source for Russia that should have never been realized by them. And we're in this position, to me, because of the strategic mistakes that President Biden has made right after he was inaugurated on the 20th of January. It dumbfounds me.
Mm-hmm. He's been saying that if Russia moves into Ukraine, there will be great sanctions. And there are many, even in both parties, that are saying that we should put the sanctions on now to show him, not do it after the fact. Do you think that they should wait for sanctions? Do you think they should do it before? Or really, sir, do you think that the sanctions will have any effect whatsoever?
I don't think the sanctions are going to have any impact at all. I think the biggest thing they can do is cut off that pipeline. Here's a country just economically constructed like we are, and we think of sanctions and what it would do to impact of this particular country. You got to look at Russia as a totally different political alignment. And I don't see sanctions really being a big issue with the Russians right at this particular point. They can always reach out to China and probably get whatever they need in terms of the type of support they might need. But, this thing, like I say, we have boxed ourselves in based on the initial actions of this administration. We're dealing with a weak hand now, as far as I'm concerned.
Sure. I was watching a report this week and totally unclassified. It was on the news where they said where Russia is, for the most part, independent, where they're getting their oil and gas being bought by Europe, specifically Germany, because 70% of their fuel comes from Germany, or I should say 70% of Germany's fuel comes from Russia. And,
correct.
And also they've already made trade deals now with China that in the event, if the United States does sanctions, they'll be able to do with Iran and China. So will the sanctions have any effect whatsoever?
Well, you look at what's going on. They're conspiring with Iran, they're conspiring with China, probably North Korea. And these guys realize we're in a box now. And here we're also talking about reducing the DOD budget. If you go back during the Cold War, we spend over 4% of our GDP on support of the military. It's down to about 2.9 now. And this administration is advocating that it even go lower. It also advocates that we reduce some of our nuclear weapons, in particular, not build any new nuclear weapons. I just don't have any idea where those sort of thoughts are coming from. If we look at the lineup of the world as it exists today, it just is frightening to me.
True. I was watching this week, in fact, I think it was General Jack Keane, and retired Army Chief of Staff of the Army, and he brought and he brought up something that was very sobering to me. He said, unlike in past years, the United States today is not able to handle a two-front war. And by that, I'm talking about how, like, let's say World War II, we had Germany and Japan as our adversaries. Today, and I'm thinking of, let's say, Russia and China, we would not be able to handle two fronts. Would you agree with General Keane on that?
Absolutely. And, we used to advocate two-front war and maybe even a third conflict of a smaller dimension going on. And now I don't even feel confident we can handle either one of these conflicts, the way we've got our forces aligned, the way we're funding these forces. And the fact is we've got them split now between two strategic theaters. And I just don't know how we're going to reinforce those theaters. And, sending a couple of thousand airborne guys, it's just a tripwire. And I think the thing we got to really watch now, and this is my own feeling, I haven't in any way to corroborate it. There's something going on in eastern Ukraine, where the people who sympathize with Russia, and you recall they moved some Russians into Ukraine years ago. And what's going on in that, there's an insurgency going on against the country of Ukraine now, and they're sort of not part of the country in any respect as we would think of being part of a country. What is going on there? Are they trying to trip something up where these people say they're threatened and have the Russians come in there respond to a potential threat of the people they construe are their friends and citizens? I think that's the place right now we really need to watch is eastern Ukraine.
General, that's an interesting point because it reminds me in 2014 when they moved into Crimea, and I think it was just this week they were talking about what they called a false flag. In other words, Putin would purposely have maybe someone fire upon his military going, well, they fired first.
Well, the thing about it, they're also talking about Ukraine being prepared to do a guerrilla war. That scares Russia. But you recall what happened in Afghanistan with Russia? And, the thing is, the American people and the Russians have something in common. They don't like to see their forces bogged down, and they don't like to see body bags sent home. So that may be a little bit of a deterrent. But I tell you, like I say, I feel very confident the oil production capability of Russia, if we can put it in jeopardy in the fact that they can sell oil, is the biggest thing we can do. And that's exactly what they ought to do now. They ought to say, one step, we cut off the oil.
From what I've read that about Vladimir Putin, that even when he was a KGB agent, he was always a risk taker. He played the field and tried to take more than what he possibly could under other normal circumstances. And I'm curious, if he is a risk taker, even when he was a KGB agent, will he try to take that risk?
We don't have a good track record in this administration. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, that evacuation, and what sort of debacle that was. And incidentally, I was the operations officer for the evacuation of Saigon, so I know a little bit what I'm talking about. We say he's a risk taker, but what is he willing to commit? In terms of a threat to his economic base and his own economic position is the thing we also need to consider. He saw what happened after the end of the Cold War. I think he's got a lasting memory. So I think his risk is he's manipulating the people in this country, and particularly our president to some degree, and certainly the people in D.C. who work with his people on a continuous basis. So I think he's a very careful risk taker. He's not a cowboy.
The United States doesn't want to see Americans in body bags. That using that as a wedge by saying stay out of it, as he was also saying how he definitely does not want Ukraine in NATO.
Think about it. We can also agree to come to their aid. They don't have to necessarily be part of NATO. I don't understand, and I think they have some observer capacity as far as NATO.
Hmm.
To me, that gives them the benefit of being associated with the members of NATO, being there at the table, so to speak. And I think we can move that far forward and accommodate both sides of the fence if we're smart about it. But I'd say let them be an observer to NATO. I see nothing wrong with that. But if you know, you go back in history, I think it was Clinton administration. You recall Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons. And part of the agreement to do away with those nuclear weapons was the fact that we would guarantee their safety. We would have preserved their country and defend them against anyone who was trying to threaten their country. So those are things that are on the table already, and a lot of people forget about that guarantee based on them getting rid of their nuclear weapons.
General, I'm glad you brought that up because I have found very few people who even know about the Budapest Memorandum. And that was
Yeah.
what you were talking about. It was in 1994. And just like you mentioned, that it was signed by Bill Clinton and I think the United Kingdom and also I think even Ireland, that if they gave up their nuclear weapons, we would protect them to do it.
That's
Well,
exactly right.
they did it.
So we're obligated to them.
Yeah.
And the other issue with Ukraine and Russia, this thing that carries back to when Biden was vice president and when he was dealing with Ukraine. I don't know what the tie-ins are, and frankly, I'm not in a position to understand it. But what are the real, true tie-ins between Biden, Ukraine, Russia, based on what we see in the paper every day involving the first family? And I tell you, it's really something that we need to consider in this equation. There's some real sort of strange, sort of past history there.
If he does go into Ukraine and take that over, will he then start getting more emboldened? And I'm thinking of our hemisphere, specifically Venezuela, a socialist country like Venezuela, and a communist country like Cuba. Do you think that he would then go back, like as of October of 1962, of going back into Cuba with nuclear missiles just to rub it in our nose?
I'm not sure that would be the case, but I look at what China's already doing. If you look at the Panama Canal and what Chinese are doing at the Panama Canal, what they're potentially doing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be Russia. It can be China. It can be one of the other sort of Iran and some of those other countries that involved with these folks, because these people are playing us in a total game atmosphere. And my sense is Russia may not play the game, but China's going to play it, or Iran's playing it. And we already see that taking place in Central and South America. China is in the Panama Canal, and we don't understand the threat they potentially pose to the Panama Canal. And also they are establishing a relationship with Nicaragua and some of those other countries down in that area. Mm-hmm. So we're not only looking at Russia, I'm looking at China. And if they go into Ukraine, what's going to happen between China and Taiwan?
True.
And this is a very threatening atmosphere that we're involved in today. Yeah. And we can't just look at Russia and Ukraine in isolation. We have to look at the totality of what's going on all throughout the world involving Russia, China, and Iran, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think from what I understand is that the Beijing Winter Olympics ends on February the 20th. So I would assume that possibly that Putin does not want to anger or irritate his closest ally, China, and do anything while the Olympics is going on. But after February 20th, though, then that would be more of a buildup. General, I'm curious too. When it comes to China, like what you mentioned, in bringing back again October of 1962, when we had those 8 to 10 days of the world was tedious, whether or not Khrushchev was putting missiles in Cuba. What China did was China invaded India. So while the news media and all the eyes were on Cuba and the United States, China made a move to India. Do you think that, out of just your thoughts, Xi Jinping with China, is that when Putin does make that move in Ukraine, then he would make that move, Xi Jinping would make that move to Taiwan?
You all offer a great question here. And the thing that I'm sort of thinking is Ukraine and Russia a rouge of some sort to give China a position to get prepared to invade Taiwan. Right now, all eyes are tied down on Ukraine, primarily Ukraine and Russia. And that's the conversation. but is there a bigger conversation going on after the Olympics in terms of some sort of way to tie us down and put China in a strategic position to be prepared to invade Taiwan? That is the one that I'm looking at. I mean, this is just old classic sort of military basic 101 Marine thinking. Something that's going on. There's an interplay going in there we don't understand. And I think the critical date it will begin to unfold and give us some of those senses that is after the Olympics. What's those 10 days or so after the Olympics?
Sure. General, hold that thought. Okay, if you're just joining us, we're talking. Very happy to have Major General James Livingston. And we're going to take a break right now, but don't go away. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking with Major General James Livingston. You've commanded everything from a rifle platoon to Mar-4 Res to maybe even more so. What are your thoughts? Putin has last I heard, over 130,000 men in the frigid winters of Ukraine, trying to keep morale, warmth, clothing, feeding. He's going to have to do something. I mean, he's either going to have to either take it all down or move. And right before going into a break, we were talking about February 20th, which is the ending of the Olympics. So they've got men there that have been there for a very long time in the frigid winters of Ukraine. You've commanded large areas, battalions of men. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's, getting back to my thoughts earlier, there's something going on that's bigger than this Ukraine-Russian situation that we're talking about now. That's the reason I think there's some sort of relationship in terms of what's going to happen after the Olympics and what's going to happen between China and Taiwan. I think that's the bigger play that's going on now, based on my estimation. The Chinese, have sort of been ramping this up, and there have been a desire for a long, long time. If you go back to Quemoy and Matsu years ago, probably long before your time, when they were shelling one another. This thing has been going on historically since the people left China and moved to Taiwan to establish that as a new country. I think there's a bigger relationship here going on, and that's the reason I think we see what's going on. Otherwise, I think Putin would have made an earlier move. I'll agree with you. I think this is an action we got to watch very carefully, but I'm not sure that we got clarity on what's going to happen here.
Sure.
But in my mind, the biggest clarity right now is what's going to happen between Taiwan and China.
Thanks, General. And we've got so much more with General Livingston. We're discussing the threats of China, Iran, including the pullout of Afghanistan, and how will we view victory, the Americans view victory today in the 21st century. But because of the time constraints, we didn't want to not air that. So what we're going to do is we're going to have part 2 of our interview, our conversation with Major General James Livingston next week. Something you do not want to miss. Also, there's a new bill in Congress that's picking up steam that will prevent members of Congress, along with their spouses, from either buying and selling stocks. But first, it looks like it happens that Congress seems to be pretty good as investors. Members of Congress and spouses have been loading up on these 10 stocks over the past year. Now, the top ones are Microsoft, along with Alphabet, Google, NVIDIA, Amazon, as well as Apple, Netflix, Morgan Stanley, and Antero Midstream. Now, that's an oil and gas pipeline, and which I'm sure AOC and Bernie Sanders may not have any of, but there's a lot of other members of Congress. Now, last year, members and lawmakers traded $355 million of stocks in their own accounts. These and other tech companies are many times in front of the same congressman with their possibilities of being regulated. And presently, some people are buying the 10-year treasuries and paying a dividend so that the treasuries pay a dividend of 2% for those bonds. Now, while the average dividend rate for the S&P 500 stock pays on average of 1.4%. So Is there a safe trade to get income from stocks? Now remember, stocks go up and stocks go down, but there are some companies that pay a good dividend through the good times and through the bad times. Now those that pay at least a 2% dividend, which is what the 10-year treasuries pay, and the least amount of variance or disruptions in the last 20 plus years, and we came up with 5 of those stocks that fit that criteria. Amcor, a packaging company that produces packing from food to pharmaceutical devices, has been at 4.1% yield, a payable yield, while some other better-known companies such as Johnson & Johnson and Kimberly-Clark, they pay a 3.5% dividend yield. Now remember, unlike treasury bonds in the stock market, stocks do go up and stocks go down of the price, so the purchase that stock will constantly change. But over 20-plus years, these companies have paid their dividends consistently. Just thought that. Well, if you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. If we'd love to write us and make it pithy, make it concise, and write us at Andre@WallStreetWrapUp.info. And now for a look ahead for next week. But first, how much will NBC be charging for a 30-second commercial on this Sunday's Super Bowl 56? We'll have that answer in just a moment. Well, how much will NBC be charging for a 30-second commercial on this Sunday's Super Bowl 56? $6.5 million for a 30-second commercial. And last year for Super Bowl 55, that cost was $5 million. That's a 30% increase from 2021. And by the way, all the commercial slots, they're sold out. And finally, speaking of Super Bowl, this Sunday is the Super Bowl, and normally a time for private jets to be flying into the host city for either the big game or just for parties. Well, this year, private charter jet companies are predicting that business to drop by more than 25%. But now here's the kicker. They're content about that drop. It seems due to the shortages of pilots and crews and catering and spare parts, jet charter companies are not able to support what they have now. In fact, last year, 41% of private jet flyers experienced delays or cancellations and in their private jet travel. And including with that, 1 in 5 had their flights canceled, and 1 in 10% were left stranded. And you thought you had problems. Oh, the humanity. The only thing worse is if your valet calls in sick. Well, in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking with investigative business reporter Charlie Gasparino. Charlie is the business reporter for Fox Business and Fox News. And prior to that, he was also doing the same thing at CNBC. He's broken many business stories, and with juries finding out Elizabeth Holmes finding her guilty as CEO of Theranos to insider trading possibilities at Capitol Hill, Charlie has reported it all, and he's a columnist for the New York Post. He'll be with us in a couple of weeks. From Fox Business, Charlie Gasparino. And remember, next week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, my guest will be the second part of our conversation with Major General James Livingston. We'll discuss China, our pullout of Afghanistan, Iran, conditions of our military today, and more. That's next week, my second part of our interview with Major General James Livingston on Wall Street Wrap-Up. And as a reminder, we repeat the show on Sunday mornings, but the best way is to set your DVR so you'll never miss an episode. That's our show, Friday, February 11th, 2022. Hope you've enjoyed it. My thanks to Major General Livingston for joining us this evening. But as always, it's you. We appreciate you for allowing us into your homes tonight. Remember, follow us on all the media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and WYES.org. So have a great weekend and a productive week as well. I'll see you next week. For Wall Street Wrap-Up, I'm Andre Laborde. Remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.